And it's wonderful to be with you on the occasion of your exhibition Sense at the Elizabeth Leach Gallery.
I'm
And
so happy
the
to be with you in
and
conversation.
the publication of that wonderful book that accompanies it with Radius Books from Santa Fe, Sense, a book. It's rare that I will say a book captures something essential in an artwork, but it is an artwork and it is the essential lexicon, I think, for this exhibition.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting. It was such an interesting process to put that book together. And then in a lot of ways, really the exhibition came out of that process and the thinking and the turning over of images and, thinking about sequencing, thinking about time and what's that experience of looking at a book. Yeah, I'd love to talk with you about that.
Well, it's wonderful because it has translated into an installation of unique works
Hmm.
of great beauty and quietude. There is something in the scale and the rhythm and the way the work has been located in this installation of your work, which I know you had a great hand in sequencing and thinking about their place on the wall, that echoes and mirrors the experience I had going through the book. And
Mm.
it makes for a very rich and a very full experience of an exhibition. When I
Yeah.
first walked in, I was reminded that you have a history of cloth. You were a weaver and a textile artist initially,
Hmm.
and it was kind of beautiful to see this image making happening in the context of the feel of cloth hanging and weighted.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting, Bruce, because it's like, really my first hand is a sewing hand, is a textile hand, is the cloth on one's lap. And the kind of, really fundamental transformations that occur through those kind of weaving and stitching processes. And, even though I haven't literally been at a loom for, many, many years. I think it is the deep structure of the work. And in these particular pieces, because they are this beautiful Japanese gampi paper, which is mounted to a cheesecloth where it's like a paper, it's both paper and cloth. And so it has, in some ways, the hand of cloth and it has the surface of paper. And yeah.
Yeah, and it makes for a very interesting moment because this Gampi paper you've chosen has a surface gloss. It's a hard finished paper, and yet in its state hanging, sometimes it's been wrinkled, sometimes it's um, smooth. The reflection is like a like a great silk tissue of some kind. It reflects and absorbs. And I noticed the other day when I was in the gallery that as I move past things, there's a slight lift in the
Mhm,
way that a
mhm.
textile will lift toward you.
Like
Um,
it's like it has a little breath in it, right?
yes,
Yes.
what they call in Indian art abhanga, that sense of the air within.
Mhm.
Yes, it's lovely.
I wanted to kind of return to something you said about the book and maybe the exhibition or the quietude, which I love that word. Is that I was talking with a former graduate student here the other day, and she reminded me that I used to use the phrase a lot, being with something
Yes.
like withness. She said, you used to say withness. And I said, oh, yeah. And I think it's partly an invitation, right, to just dwell in the time of the thing in front of you. And that it is a kind of slowing of attention.
Well, it is such a beautiful invitation
Mm,
to look deeper from within. You
mhm,
know, we, you know, it, there are all these wonderful analogies about how um, to look is to begin to think about the haptic, because to look is to touch in another way, but the physicalness that manifests in these works without touching is a knowledge that is in the hand.
Yeah, very much, yeah. I mean, I really started out with like really thinking when we were working on the book, we were thinking, going back through all of these images that have come from many different projects. But what ties all of those together is the haptic. It's contact. And so whether
Yes.
the image of a person touching a membrane, or whether it's the touch of the animal on the flat bed scanner, or it's about things making contact and the surface. And because they all have this shallow depth of field, and that really kind of runs across all the work. I think that's how they're tied to the textile, right? Because it's like where contact is made, like where two threads cross, is where touch occurs. What's the visual? Is there like, what's the visual like? Is analog the right word, or it's like, how is a thing you see a felt thing?
Absolutely, because it requires. Well, it doesn't require that you've actually experienced touching a bird's breast and the softness of the feather with the down underneath. But the work, when it takes an image of a avian specimen, has this immediate touch for me that brings me back to chickens on my grandmother's farm and geese in the Thule of a duck hunt, and it was amazing how immediate it was. And we know, you've often said quite eloquently, I thought, about the 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 sense of the cloth and the hand, and the way you only know and experience it by the drape and the fall, the density, the structure, the weave, by touch. And yet in these works, there is the immediacy of recognition if you are thinking about what you're seeing, of that place where the threads cross, that slight lift, that compression, that locking together of something that becomes color and form, density, twists, all of the things that happen when you describe cloth. And I was reminded of those as I walked through the exhibition. The imagery in this work is quietly compelling. It speaks to, for me, I think, this moment in time that we're experiencing because many people talk about coming to the end of something, of experiencing it through COVID, through the socio-political scene, through the turmoil, a coming to the end of a great cycle. And in this work, there's almost something elegiac about it, but that's my projection from looking and feeling in response to the looking. Where did you start with these things? I mean, was it discovering a leaf? Was it finding a scanner? Where did you begin as you started this journey?
I mean, all of those places really, like, I think, so it's this question you're talking about, in some ways you're experiencing a sense of recognition in the thing that you see, right? And I think it's the same thing in the making. Like, so each of the bodies of work that are in the book and then in the show, in the exhibition project, come from seemingly very serendipitous, accidental crossings with a tool or a material. So like the whole process of photographing people through this membrane that I was given by chemists at Bayer Material Sciences, it was a project where artists were partnered with industries in Pittsburgh, and And they knew I was interested in the tactile, and they engineer the surface of things. But when they put this thing in my hand and I put my hand underneath it, and I was like, oh, I can only see what touches. This is really interesting. And then using it, recognizing that it took a traditional photographic setup of the camera and the person conducting the shoot and, the lights and the subject. And just by having this membrane between the camera and the voice and the person being photographed, it changed everything in the relation. So not only was I quite interested in the qualities of image, that what is near is in focus and what is far is out of focus in a very particular way, but that when you're standing back there, you can't see through this material. So it means that you're listening.
Oh, that's
So,
very interesting.
yeah. And so I think that the kind of images are a consequence not just of the quality of this membrane, but also the way it inverts what usually happens when you offer yourself up to be photographed. So it's like people have said, oh, it's like in this private space, because we made a little kind of booth, like so that you kind of stepped into behind the screen, and in some cases into like a little booth, and it was open to the sides, but it felt very private. And so there was something about the intimacy at the same time that there's exposure, the kind of listening at the same time that you're like kind of presenting yourself. And I think that what became interesting to me is an ongoing process that became part of many projects, especially a big one was with the Dell Medical Center at University of Texas in Austin and the Landmarks Project, is that every person who stood there, like a little bit different thing happened. And so it continued, to be alive to me as a process.
Well, and I think there's something in those membrane photographs about the translucency and transparency that one has a sense of, like a dream, of an intimacy and a foreignness simultaneously. The way that hands emerge as they come to the membrane and the arm disappears into an ambiguous whiteness.
Yeah.
And it's not like the black background behind you at the moment where only shiny things come around, but it is about something as a viewer that you experience in a surprisingly immediacy, because your eye begins to search for the fact, just as we do with these pictures of the birds and leaves, that as we move closer to them, the surface textures become real.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I think that in all the work in different ways and different scales, it's like this. I don't know if you'd say choreography or the relationships between the near and the far. That actually, like the intimacy of here and the landscape of there, that is something the simultaneity of that has been part of the work for a long time in a way that, in some ways only more recently recognized. And I think that has a lot to do, with this other smaller component of the show with the concordances, the language pieces, and that like I think a lot about like the intimacy of reading, whether you're reading a book that's an object or on the screen. It's like, I've talked about this immediacy of the world of this at the same time that you're in the faraway world of where the book is taking you or the thing you're reading. And our capacity in our attention to hold those spaces simultaneously.
Well, yeah, because in the concordances and the collages that juxtapose a fragment of a textile exposing its sense of being with word or words that unfurl in lines. That notion you talk about when you talk about words, which I've loved. It's this notion about the alphabet unfurls in lines, and words be letters become words, imply sounds, and then our sentences and meanings. But with these works, I think you enter in the same way.
Mm.
You come into that main room of the gallery and you see a, a series of individual images that are grouped in twos and fours and walls, and they become questions and descriptions. And then at some point, your thoughts and your memories as the viewer have to become engaged. And that's the thing. I think of the great power of this work now is how it exists and it evokes, it suggests and it defines, and all of those are available, but not you haven't hit them with a hammer so that they sit there hard and fast.
Yeah, it's really this thing about like your attention. So like to go back to the leaves, like I started walking the dog, and then why is it that you're always picking things up off the ground, right? Like that leaf or that acorn or that stick, and not all the other ones. Like that what is it that pauses your attention, and then like bringing those into the studio, and then having another kind of like almost like aha moment when we would see it transform by just its weight and its curl and the degree to which it was now in a state of dying. I mean, that's the thing, you use the word elegiac, that like all of these things are passing. And I was thinking about how, like, when you look at a tree, and I think we all have more and more and more and more respect for trees and what they do. But it's like, when you look at the tree, it's like, in some ways, even though they're individualized, all the leaves look the same, right? So like, if the tree is like, the choir sort of, and you don't really see the individual voices, then it's like the leaf that falls is the soloist. And the leaf falls, and it's like each one like falls on the ground. Each one curls and dries in its own way. And I think there's something about how that happens. It's like paying attention to that is really kind of been the process for me of that part of the series of the work. It's like it's particular, right? Just the way each of these pieces of cloth is really very particular, and then the relationship it makes in its facticity to a word and its felt or its abstraction in some ways. It's like what happens is those worlds come into relation, and in the way they do, is that like a form of touch?
Yeah, my mind races because we all experience that walk on the beach, the walk in the fall, and you look down and a leaf speaks to you. It says, "Pick me up." You find an acorn and you see a couple more, and you pick the green one that
Yeah.
still shows its life force, and it dries brown, and you carry them home. And what I love in this work is the shift in scale that equates the cycling and the color of the leaf with a bird, and a bird of a different scale, and that you've taken them, and in changing their individual scale to become the scale in the work, and relocating them emotionally and intellectually into that kind of all things great and good and equal, but each of them poetic. It raises the question of, in making these works, which are printed uh, by a digital process, how did you work with the color? Is it painterly, or are you by that I mean in intensity and tone and vivacity, or is it something else? Are you playing straight with us?
Uh, it's pretty straight. I mean, the thing is that we're using these scanners that are very, you know, they're, I would say, early generation, and they came into my hands also through a very accidental process. Um, and and I think that, well, so Kara Goot, an artist who works with me here in the studio, is really, really good with color. And so one of the things that structures the book, because we didn't know how to wrap our heads and our hands and our process around the thousands of images we had. And so we're like, well, it seems like things, it's like color is what starts to make things that might not seem like they have a relationship start to work together. So Kara, certainly for the book, like really worked on balancing the backgrounds and balancing the colors, not like radically changing them, but that was kind of a more like I would say a balancing of their temperatures. You know, unlike when, like all the new scanners that they have that are more and more improved and more, you see more and more, you know, I look at them and I think, well, you see more, but you feel less. Like it's like almost too much information. And so I think the color is what, in some ways, really is a result of the process, tweaked and balanced a little bit, but then also of the paper. So the Gampi paper, you know, has a tone, and it has a, like the membrane we photographed through, it has a kind of translucency and a transparency and an opacity. And it's like, it actually has, like, it lets the white of the wall come through a little bit. So, you know, all of these material qualities are part of then what you actually experience in the images. And we played a lot, like here in the studio, like we printed everything out just on inexpensive draft paper, full scale, because unless we could see how they were working, we couldn't see it. And we did the same thing for the book. We would put everything up on the wall and we just start moving it around, and then we would like videotape it, because I was like, well, really, a book organizes time, and so we need to think about this as a film, even though, and then of course you have the relationship of each, you know, recto and verso, and it was really fun. It was also kind of daunting because we had so many images and it wasn't a narrative that was structuring it.
No, but it's interesting how, like the exhibit, as you move through the book, the rhythm of the differentiation of page size and the layering within a spread. A traditional spread is 2 pages, and in this book, there may be 8.
Yeah. Well,
And each of them shifts, and the tone carries you. And then on the outside pages, there are 2 printed tones. So it's as if you've multiplied it again by changing the surface or the color. And in these works, I noticed that as you move around the room in the exhibition, you move from white to a tangible gray background, and that there is a sympathetic space of air around the object recorded
yeah,
that is a color.
yeah. So that's like that atmosphere, like like the atmosphere that's in there. That's partly how we scan. I mean, just in the sense that we tent things with the Japanese paper, and it's partly to control the light, but it also ends up giving different weather to the different kind of,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah,
And
it is almost it's atmospheric, and therefore I like weather. It it cools you a little bit, or it warms you a little bit. And you know, the leaf takes on a sometimes a warm dryness as you look at it. And then the the distancing of the bird as it becomes, very little of it is actually in focus, but most of it is this glowing white, and it cools it down and it becomes brighter and more tangible in a way. That's it's a very interesting experience, and all of it requires one to look and respond, look and reflect, and look and assimilate. And I find I I love this kind of art. I love art that pushes me to engage.
I mean, one of the things, Bruce, about weather, if you think about it, like, you feel the weather before you see it, right? Like, or it's like, I think about, there was a point in my life when I was much younger and I lived in the Canadian Rocky Mountains for several years. And it was like when the Chinooks would come through and the temperature would fluctuate this enormous amount, like 40 degrees in an hour or something. And it was like your body was like full of expectation. You knew something was happening, but you couldn't see anything. And I think that sense of kind of a knowingness or a recognition that isn't one that is easy to point to or name, I think that's what I hope is partly present in this work.
Well, I can only affirm what you hope is there is. It is in the sense of how close it comes to being a felt texture, to being an experienced temperature. That relationship that happens. A book is an exchange between the writer and the reader, between the maker and the viewer. It's all of those things that you've noted that it becomes because of the changing perspective of the participants. And with this work and the sequence of leaf, bird, fabric, leaf, bird, there is in that string of thoughts and string of colors a warming and cooling of the eye, and therefore the brain begins to engage in another way. What am I seeing? There's that cayenne red rust on one of the leaves that just lifts up.
It's pollen, yeah.
Yeah, it's magical, and it, like the spice, it suddenly tantalizes your senses with its color and its presence across that leaf, which has viridian and gray, and it's a magical moment against the path.
Well, and I think because really work is sensual, right? Like, I think the experience of art is a sensual experience in some ways.
Yes.
And I think that allowing ourselves to be invited in, or to allow ourselves to have that experience, I think, why it is that we're, it seems like we live in a culture where we're so, we might look at something and we're immediately like, what does it mean? Right? And it's like, well, it's like, why is the thing in front of us not enough, right? To just spend time and allow it, like, its voice, right? And
Mhm.
it's like, is it that we just trust, that kind of the a kind of sensuous knowledge? Really strikes me how we're so patterned to do that.
Or have we been, as the march of modernism and the contemporary conceptualized moment come in, have we lost our habit or our openness to something in the obdurance of the object presented, as opposed to these in which they are about an exchange. They're an exchange between what is seen and not seen, what is known and what is discovered. It's always these places that, if this then that, but not that it's there. And you keep dancing backwards and forwards in your mind. And it's hard for people sometimes. They want to know, Will the title tell me what to think?
Yeah.
Am I allowed to feel? Some people are immediately feelers. That makes something else. They discover more in life, I suspect, but maybe not.
One of the things that David Schicke, who designed the book, and it was really his brilliant understanding of the structure and how we could put those like books within the book and the different pages and different weights of paper, is that he picked out that fragment of text from a collage. I think it starts the book. It says the feeling at times. You're going to make that first? Like, I don't know that I would do that, but okay. He was like so right, because it's like the intelligence of felt experience and felt knowledge is a really important intelligence. And I think that we don't always have the vocabularies to privilege that and pay attention to it. But it's like Antonio Damasio in his writing about neurobiological processes, like talks about how if we only had our rational brains, we couldn't survive.
No, that's right.
And that we think through, thinking is something that happens through our whole corpus. Yeah, not to cut that off. But.
No, and it's why the work elicits responses that are not only tactile but are heard, they're tasted, they're smelled. There's something in the smell of dry leaves that is for a moment in an experience of one of the panels, and it's quite telling. I was interested in the notion of the collages, which I've always loved. You've been doing them since I think 2017, someone said. So they go back, but the collages in the relationship of the ground you work on, which is found paper that are like end papers of books, that initial dust cover, that aging paper that often carries nothing on it but its surface and its memory of being touched and leafed, and using that as a ground instead of a bright white piece of paper. And then there are found words, and the words and the cloth, there's a balancing of the elements that I find sometimes precarious, sometimes delightfully sensual. When you start to unravel a piece of silk, or you use a patterned cloth, of course, they confuse people. They can't accept the beauty. They want to understand why that word with this blue cloth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it is like life's conundrums. You experience something without a guide, without a lexicon to understand it. I think they're quite interesting. And you're presenting many of them as diptychs or triptychs now. Mm-hmm. I remember seeing singles and finding them quite full. And now there's it's like a bully and a victim. Sometimes it's two celebrants, and they happen in a very interesting way.
That's a process, and everything like the leaves on the ground is a found thing, right? It's a fragment that comes from something. And I remember actually at one point trying to make them on like nice pieces of paper, and it's like, oh, it doesn't work at all. It's something about like, it's that each thing gives you something to respond to, and that's how the work really grows. So it's always responsive. Like, so it's this particular paper from this book. It's like the scale of that, the way its edges are worn, and it's like it comes into some felt relationships, with this particular cloth, and then this word that is not a literal relation, but hopefully a somewhat evocative one, like where it's like, oh yes, it's like that, even though I can't quite say what that is. And so it invites you into a kind of both kind of a real tactfulness and also an abstractness uh, of relation. And I it's because I work on often on such a large scale, or you're working on projects over many years, and so finding a process that I could do in the studio and just be totally immersed in the attention of like this next to that next to this and moving things around. I couldn't be happier. I love the attention of the kind of thinking that process invites me into. And it's so hard. It's kind of like the book. It's so hard to say exactly what it is.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I think the collages are a wonderful example of the the focus and the blur of attention, the way they record your travel from the ground to the pieces to the assembly, but it's the invention of something without a name that becomes the collage. And the satisfaction of all of the things we look for: surface, color, texture, line, thread, uh, letters in a line, a word, three words, and then finding ourselves mulling them and thinking about them afterwards. After you leave the room, after you think back, and it's quite satisfying because, like a good drawing, the drawing stays with you. It's not simply its process, it's not simply its finish or its subject. It is the gestalt between it, the object, and looking and the viewer. And behind it all is the hand of the artist.
Well, and I think it's like drawing. It's interesting that you would say that because I don't draw really in a conventional sense, with a stylus or pencil in my hand. But I think the scanning, like especially the wand scanning, with it's like a drawing with light, and each passage of light
Mm-hmm.
is a different image. But it's like you're really paying attention to how you're breathing and how you're holding your hand, and it's like everything is about all the contingencies of that live moment and presence. And I think making the collages, they feel like a form of drawing for me, from my hand, even
Yes.
though they're pencil and ink or whatever. And um, it's interesting, because I think I hope in time that maybe this sequencing that you're saying of two or three together, like I would love to make a book just with these, and I think it'd be interesting to figure out how does it get structured? Like if the new book, Sense with Radius, uh, uh, is really structured by color as much as anything.
Mm-hmm.
Structure us these being together.
Yeah. Well, I think it's so much a part of how um, the entire exhibition comes together. The second room with featuring the collages, and then that one text with the pink silk. And it's the scale shift between the intimacy of the word and you moving close, and then standing back for the shimmer and the reflective life of the fabric is quite amazing. And then the two very large images, the doll figure and the back of something that appears to be a woman at either end of the room, shifting the scale again. This interplay you have between object and room, viewer and thing, I think is very well played there.
Thank you for that. I mean, I think it's also interesting. So the large figure that comes from a collection of Barbara Ludowski's at the Mattress Factory, and the figure on the other side is an ivory. It's a religious figure, so it's like a little saint.
A little votive of some kind.
Yeah, and that comes from a project I was doing in Portugal. And what I sort of enjoyed seeing for the first time is like, oh, you have the sacred and the profane there. Like, but also, I just wanted to say that, in some ways, it's also, as an artist, like just trusting process. And one of the things about the scanners and these wand scanners and these old flatbed scanners is that they're very portable, they're light, they allow me to actually take a process into all sorts of different kinds of places and have a way to be there. And so, what's interesting to me is that the tools become a vehicle to be responsive to what I find. And so the same way that I'm responsive to the qualities of the paper and the collages, or the curl of the leaf in the bigger works. And I always know that if a process kind of keeps opening up, like photographing people through this material, it's like if it keeps like kind of giving in some ways, it actually allows me to also be in the world, through
Yes.
in a way. I'm not a studio-based artist, right? And it allows me to be social, right? In a way that I really love, and hope that that's ongoing.
No. Well, it that portability, I think, is something we think of scanners and that technology as being locked to a electric outlet in the wall and in a place, but that they can be portable enough that you can go into a research facility for ornithology and open drawers and move directly with that, and the interaction with the technician and the scientist who works with them, talking about qualities that your eye is seeing something, but you don't have a name, you're not naming it, and their process of giving you a gift of the naming. And it shifts then through the interaction, what you bring back to us through the vehicle of the print and the paper and the hanging. It's that's the kind of richness that this work has and needs, I think, in its success, and uses in its success.
I mean, I think it kind of raises this question about information. What kind of information do we need? What kind of things, information do images carry? And I was, just before we were installing the show in Portland, I was working in Corvallis, where I'm in the middle of a project with the integrative biologist and botany and plant pathology departments at Oregon State University. And I was meeting with really this extraordinary marine biologist, and I was sharing with her some of the images, and she was like, "Oh, like there was something that communicated through these that was different than, like the kind of really incredible rendering that is now possible through the amplification of lenses and light and
Right.
the microscopic, and yet this held something even for her, that maybe had another place. And it was interesting to hear her respond. Yeah. And to think about what moves people. Like, so she's, it's Jane Lubchenco, and she's very involved with marrying science with policy, and has a special appointment right now at the White House. And so we had a conversation about what is it, how do we have what are the narratives we need right now? I think about what are the words we need right now? What are the images we need to see right now? Where are we, culturally, in so many different dimensions? And, what is it that motivates us? And I think so much of what motivates us is feeling something strongly, right? So how do you work with that, and how are images part of that? I think about that a lot. What do we need to
Well,
see?
and what you said about information and how much information do you need about something, and do you need its names, is equivalent to asking people asking, well, what does it mean? I'm looking at these images. What do they mean? And some people will respond to the fact that they are specimen birds. They're dead. They're for scientific study, and they'll jump to one conclusion, and it may really be about their life experience with death, um, and they transfer it. Or for me, there's something in the kind of singular form that the bird takes on, and its presence that is both empowered and quiet in a way that you don't see birds. They're always moving, twittering, and it's so rare when you see a hummingbird stop,
Mm.
and it's a different kind of sensation when they quit beating their wings and they just rest for a moment. And the so I think these works because of the stage of the life of the leaf, and then the juxtapositioning with these scientific specimens is and it raises those issues. I think it's also a matter of scale and your choice of where to hang them on the wall,
Oh, yeah, very low.
very low, so that one is responding as if looking down at or on a, it's our relationship is privileged in the slight way, and yet you've considered the whole room. I Once an installation artist, once a textile artist, always a textile installation artist. The way you've addressed the entire wall with the apparatus that hangs the scrolls and their specific rhythm, like the warp of a on a loom, and then these images that happen below, and it pulls us down into the space that's intimate, that's close. It feels close at hand. Yes.
That's really interesting. I never thought about it that way, but you're right. Like in a loom, you have the the warp, and then where you're doing your weaving is very close to it, right? It's like where
That's right. Yeah.
I hadn't thought about it like that. That's interesting, Bruce.
Well,
Yeah.
it's again, it's not in the work per se, but it's in your life experience. And my brother was a weaver, and and so his loom was eight 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 harness loom, and it it always fascinated me that the kind of rigor and form. So to return, so the conscious decision to lower them, was that arrived at in thinking about the ultimate scale of the wall? I mean, because the wires could be shorter and still function in a way to suspend and suggest like old negative frames in a laboratory, in a printing facility for photographs. And
Yeah, it's a good question. I haven't really thought that much about it. I just knew when we hung them like this, playing around in the studio, because we had these old rods from some other experiment that didn't work out. And next year, they were actually in the recycling bin to go out. And I'm like, wait, we can use those. And when I hung them, it was like, oh, that works. It's like how the image becomes a thing. But also, I think it's because it's as much about what's there as what's not there. So by extending those rods up, that negative space becomes part.
yes,
And then hanging them low on the wall. I mean, I'm not a very tall person. So, selfishly, I'm hanging them at my height. But I also think it's that it puts them where your heart is, puts them in relationship to your body, as you said earlier, very beautifully in a particular way. And so that's part of the invitation in. That's part of this witness. That's like asking you to join it, not consume it. And that's what I hope the gesture of the work is.
Absolutely, and there's something else we haven't talked about, and it's the old technology of a vinyl record.
Oh yeah.
And a man whistling.
It's a woman whistling.
It is a woman whistling. Okay, I couldn't tell, and it doesn't play continuously, because they're, I suspect it could drive one crazy, or one would finally understand every music. Talk about that? Could you speak to that? I find it quite engaging. But
I mean, I think it's so beautiful. I cannot whistle. So that recording is something I made with Emily Egan, who's a vocalist in New York. And I had met on another project. And when I met her, she told me that she had twice, I think I have this in the world champion whistler. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. So anyway, years later, I got in touch with her. And I think that the whistling is sort of this same articulation of proximity and distance that we were talking about in other ways. She's, in some ways I asked her, like, whistle to yourself, as if you're not, it's not virtuosic. It's like you're keeping yourself company with the sound of your breath. And at the same time, whistling is something that signals at a distance and is greater than the reach of our sight or our hand. And so I think there's this way that there's the kind of proximity and distance that is held in that sound. And so it plays periodically when Kelly and Louisa want to put it on in the gallery. And I think what it does is, I think it's part of maybe creating, again, an atmosphere or weather, in this case of sound, where it just slows you. It maybe allows you to feel like you can take a little bit of time in there. It's not performing for you, and it was it's part of the atmosphere.
yeah. Well, I think it's very, it suggests, again, all of those wonderful parallels you like to work with. You're using an early standard scanner. You're using a vinyl record. You're using a traditional laminated paper, like a scroll, but it's very much contemporary, cross-cultural. It's hung with uniform metal apparatus. It has all of those kind of backwards and forwards. The hand is, because it's photographic, is obscured but evident because of your handheld scanner and the printing and the nuance and things, so that the work continuously brings you backwards and forwards in time, technically, physically.
Well, I think, don't you think that's like, so artists work so often with technologies that are passing out of currency in some way, right? Like well, think of all the films being made on an iPhone now, right? But it's like when things become very available and how they become a tool, and how those tools, I mean, I think it's interesting that like there's this intersection of like a particular kind of, like in this case, there's a particular kind of image that's made from this kind of scanner. It's not made by other things. And different cameras see in really different ways. And and I think that, like, even with this paper, like I've just learned that this Gampi paper is really, that has this quality, is no longer available because the plant material is not available and the processes have changed and it's not the same quality. It doesn't have the same sheen. And, so there's this moment where this kind of tool and this kind of material cross, and then, it's like old Kodachrome film, right? And then there's no longer that color.
Yes.
And I think, I think all artists, you're kind of trying to work with what's at hand, what's available, and what you can do with it and how it transforms things. And, you're using things that they're not necessarily meant for, but I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with this, but it's like, it's the same way I suppose you're talking about backward and forward, that like we're part 19th and 17th and 15th century at the same time. We're 22nd century almost, like it's like we straddle these. And I think even the choice of the images, Bruce, in the show, like that really old, that ceramic pot comes from a Roman collection in Portugal, and that had been excavated on the site where I was working. And it's so old, and it's also so contemporary, right, in its form, and so kind of I don't know, iconic, emblematic. What would be the right word? And so I was thinking, like in this configuration, you have animals, you have the birds, you have the plants, and you have the stones. The only cultural objects are the two loom weights. Those two circles are loom weights.
Mm-hmm.
The pitcher, which is so the loom, and the container that holds something. That's like, these are the first acts of culture. And
Yes.
that sort of was the logic for me of why those objects included in this kind of array and sequence.
I think that's a beautiful place to end, to talk about finding new relations with known and the unknown, discovering through attention and quiet looking, the gift that comes with the work.
Well,
thank you, Anne. This is wonderful.
Thank you for all your intention and sort of being with the work. I mean, it was so wonderful to be in the gallery with you and to feel that resonance as you spent time with it.